Hello. Okay, part 4. We're continuing with our video about liberal icons. We just spoke about how Edward R. Murrow had hired Walter Cronkite, who became the most trusted man in America because of his apparent honesty, fair-mindedness, trustworthiness during his broadcasts in the 1960s. But that, as I wrote in my book, all came to an end when he decided to figuratively and literally step out from behind the microphone and alter journalistic history. He was not in favor of the Vietnam War, but couldn't really do anything about that because of journalistic integrity. He went to Vietnam in 1968 to report on the Tet Offensive, which, by any fair observation, at least retrospectively now, was a victory. And had that occasion been used in the positive by journalists like Walter Cronkite, who had the power over millions of Americans, it could have helped launch the beginning of the end of the war and in a possible victory. But it wasn't. In fact, our friend Uncle Walter decided to lie about the Tet Offensive. He called it a stalemate, which was not a stalemate. But he used his negative feelings about the war, and it influenced the negative feelings, or helped spark, continue, add to whatever the negative feelings about the war for millions of Americans. Um, when he came back, he had a broadcast where he literally stepped aside from the microphone and looked at everyone in the camera in the eye and said that his own feelings about the war, which he felt were not so hot. This had never been done in broadcast history. Outside of an editorial comment, which he was not an editorialist, no anchor, no major news person had ever done anything like it. Express their actual feelings about something instead of just giving the cold hard facts of a news story. And from that point forward, after having done this egregious act of malfeasance with regard to journalism integrity, he continued to manipulate the news regarding the war by showing photographs and video out of context to make the war look worse than it was, and to indict America for being corrupt, criminal in its activities regarding the war and whatnot. As I wrote in my book, also, if you want to blame somebody for soldiers being spit on when they returned, you can thank Walter Cronkite, at least in part. He was also noted for constantly accepting freebies from groups and organizations that wanted his time and wanted his favor. And he was more than happy to accept them. They came in the form of junkets or overseas plane rides to Caribbean islands and getaway destinations, all on the expense of the lobbyists and special interest groups that wanted his favor. Now, this was strictly, at the time, today anything goes, it seems, in journalism, but at the time it was strictly verboten amongst journalists and organizations, news organizations at that high level, because it was believed that anybody who could take a freebie, which in a way is a type of bribe, you might say, could be influenced or corrupted to uh, going with the opinions of the people giving you the money or giving you the freebie. You would lean in their direction and favor their point of view, favor their whatever it was, and that would be a anathema to journalistic integrity and non-bias, and so it was frowned upon. Cronkite had no problem ever taking a freebie. It can be said that opinion journalism began with him on that night in 1968, and it's only gone downhill ever since then. Jumping out of journalism and getting into jurisprudence, there have been many, and more specifically at the high-end Supreme Court, there have been a lot of Supreme Court justices who you could consider to be activist judges. Blackmun, Brandeis, a number of them. If you really want to get into the deep dive of just who these justices are, I would recommend a book by Mark Levin called Men in Black. I'm singling out one, Earl Warren, because the liberals like to use him against Republicans and conservatives because he was appointed by a Republican, and he was a Republican in his prior political life. And all that proves is that the progressive strain in the Republican Party was all but dead, but it wasn't buried. And it manifested itself in a guy like Earl Warren, who was around from 1891 to 1974 and was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in addition to a Republican governor, I believe, of California. He was an activist judge, as I mentioned, and he pushed a liberal interpretation of the Constitution. If you think that's a new thing, it's not. It's been going on for well over 100 years. His court often ruled in favor of criminals and often ruled against things like prayer in school. His court decisions regarding due process, however, are the ones that had the most impact on our society. During his time as Chief Justice, the Supreme Court outlawed evidence from, added the right of criminals to have a lawyer if they couldn't afford one. Indigent defendants, maybe before they were actually criminals. You have the right to an attorney if you can't afford one is a result of that court. Also outlawing evidence from illegal search and seizures. A lot of criminals who are known to be dead guilty, but of course deserved their time in court, got off because evidence that would have proved their guilt but was obtained through an illegal search or seizure and therefore inadmissible in a court of law was set free walking because of that new restriction, handcuffing the cops. And of a lot of these types of court orders or Supreme Court decisions all coalesced into what's known as the Miranda rights. In 1964, case Miranda versus U.S. or whatever it was called. This and all those rights that someone says when you are arrested and detained by the police force around the country. As it turns out, in 10 years, and really beyond that, but just in the 10 years following Miranda, the violent crimes and homicide rate in the United States shot up dramatically, doubling in New York City just by alone in those 10 years as a result of those restrictions. Now, I'm not saying that these were always a bad thing, but things have consequences. When you liberalize the penal system, when you handcuff the enforcers, this is what you get. And it took 20 years, 25 years before those rates saw a significant drop. Not till the late 80s did violent crimes and murders ever finally start to drop off. And a lot of that can be blamed on Earl Warren's court. And now we get into some of the more, back into some more activistic people, and into what would be considered feminists, although these were more militant feminists who took the idea of equality and perverted it into what we have today. These were the pioneers of the modern feminist, which was a far cry from the ones that wanted equal rights in voting and the rest. These were the ones who were just nasty. There are a lot more than this. These were just handpicked to give some kind of idea of what we're dealing with. Betty Friedan. She was alive from 1921 to 2006. She was a outspoken Marxist, pro-abortionist. She was the founder of NARAL, the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League, which is basically the main driving force behind the pro-abortion movement. I will never call it a pro-choice movement because they never choose life. Therefore, they are a pro-abortion movement. If you don't like it, stick it. She was also co-founder of NOW, the National Organization for Women. Now had been a pretty decent advocate for the ERA and equal rights for women until they became so left-wing in the late 1980s that a number of prominent NOW members had to leave simply because they had taken what was going to be an equal rights organization and turned it into a left-wing propaganda machine. Famous people like Tammy Bruce, who basically became a conservative, if not just at least certainly a right-winger. Ran away from NOW as the president of the LA chapter of NOW with her tail on fire because of how left-wing they had become. They turned her into a right-winger. Thanks, NOW. Over 63... Now here's the legacy of Betty Friedan's pro-abortion NARAL organization. Now this is the performance of the abortions is Planned Parenthood, but the drive for more abortions is NARAL. Now here's the legacy of Betty Friedan and the abortion movement. Over 63 million babies, I'm sure it's higher now because that figure was from a couple years ago, have been killed by abortion since 1967. And I say killed. I can also say murdered. That's an average of 3,000 a day. And 1 billion plus, and I've seen a figure as 150, or so 1.5 billion also, but be conservative about it, 1 billion plus worldwide in the last 100 years. And that, of course, goes back to Margaret Sanger. 41% of New York City pregnancies end in abortion today. 52% of abortions of African Americans pregnancies end in abortion. 52%. Margaret Sanger would probably be saying, why is that number so low? 86% of Americans, and this has been higher before, and I'm not sure where this number comes from, but it's certainly an outrageously high percentage. 86% of Americans use abortion for convenience. In other words, a type of birth control. The hypocrisy of the National Organization of Women now, today, they only advocate for liberal women's rights. They're routinely silent whenever a right-wing, a right-leaning woman is in trouble for, like a pro-life feminist. There are pro-life feminists out there. They don't like to admit them, but there's a lot of them. They're always silent when those people have something to say, which proves that they're not actually for women. They're just for liberal women. Betty Friedan once equivocated the suburban housewife from back in the 1950s, which she could not stand, by the way, to prisoners in Nazi concentration camps. Now, when you have to go that far to prove a point, your point is meaningless. Gloria Steinem, who was born in 1934, still alive, feminist radical, a population control advocate, and an abortionist, famous for wearing a "I had an abortion" t-shirt. Like that's something to be proud of. Isn't that supposed to be a personal thing? Isn't that supposed to be a sad thing? Isn't that supposed to be an unfortunate thing? Not something to have parties and celebrate with? She once said, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." And of course, being the hypocritical liberal she is, she ends up getting married in the late 90s. She once opined that birthing children is the, quote, fundamental cause of climate change. Come again? I thought that was greenhouse gases. Is birthing children creating greenhouse gases, or some kind of emanation from the female genitalia I'm not aware of? She justifies abortion as a means to avoid overpopulation. Or maybe it's the overpopulation that's causing the greenhouse gases. Boy, I thought it was coal, fossil fuels, automobiles. Oh yeah, that's right, we breathe CO2. Well, we covered that. The plants like it, and you're for the plants. You can't have both things, folks. They want it all. She once described slavery as a human right, and she goes on and on about justifying this thinking, trying to prove she's not pro-slavery by saying how much of a human right it is. Her logic is, I don't know. What slavery has to do with any of it, I don't know, but this is a thing she was known for saying. Not making this stuff up, folks. You can look it up. Speaking of overpopulation, we can't go anywhere without talking about another dingbat, and his name was Paul Ehrlich. Still alive, I believe. A writer, an overpopulation zealot, and supposedly a biologist by trade. He predicted in the 60s that in the 1970s we would see hundreds of millions of people starving to death in this country, and that America would not exist by the year 2000. That's what he predicted, because of overpopulation. The fear-mongering of the left knows no bounds, and he's the guy who started this whole thing. Soylent Green was written because of Paul Ehrlich, probably. In his 1968 book, The Population Bomb, that's where he predicted this. Turns out deaths from starvation declined during the 25-year period that he described from to the year 2000. Not increased, declined. He also was famous for losing a bet to a man named Julian Simon, where he stated that mineral resources would decline and their costs increase. Simon predicted that a decrease would occur, knowing that the economy and the market would find substitutes for minerals that became less abundant. Simon, of course, won the bet. As a result of all this failure, of course, NBC gave Paul Ehrlich a 12-part series, documentary, I guess, to discuss global ecological issues, and given an Emmy for doing that job, like I said before. Failure in the Democrat Party or from the left almost always results in a promotion or some reward of some kind. It didn't matter. This guy couldn't predict the clothes he was going to wear the next day. NBC said, that's the man for us. And we'll try to finish this on the next part. See you then.